And now, without further ado, please welcome Stacy Daniels.
Well, thank you, Larry, for the kind words. And thank you, kind audience, for being here. It's such a nice day outside. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story. It can be a short story, or it can be a long story. It can be a sad story, or it can be a happy story. It can be a tragedy, or it can be a comedy. And I will leave it up to you, dear listeners, to make your decisions. And I'm very open to questions, but first I have to open proceedings officially. Those of you who are hard of hearing or not so hard of hearing may wish to. Now that I have your attention, as I say, I want to talk about a story, and it can be short or long or tragic or sad, and you will make the decision. There's two points of view on the tragedy comedy of Crystal Lake, one by Mr. Case, who wrote The Tragedy of Crystal Lake, by a survivor, little 17-page booklet back in 1922. He worked for Archibald Jones, the perpetrator of the deed, for about 1 week at $1.25 a day. And then 50 years after the fact of being a 17-year-old whippersnapper back in 1873, never seen a canal boat or a railroad car in his existence. Benzie County was the boonies back then, and now it's such a roaring, developed, vibrant community, and you all are part of it. When Mr. Case gave his book back in 1922, he didn't write down the deed very well. And 50 years later, when he became a successful state senator, he recollected it from 50-year perspective in a little 17-page booklet, which you're all familiar with, The Tragedy of Crystal Lake, which is probably on every coffee table in the Crystal Lake watershed. I got to thinking about this story in the early 40s, being born townie and lakey of Crystal Lake in Frankfort. There had to be more to the story than just somebody that came from nowhere, pulled the plug, and watched the water go down the drain. Some years later, after thinking about this for a long time, 7 years to be exact, more or less, I started reviewing about the late 1980s or so, and found several interesting features. The original project map, the reason why Archibald Jones came to town, and slowly discovered the consequences, and that eventually became part of my large book, which is a copy on the back with the original map in the centerfold, Comedy of Crystal Lake. So there's point, counterpoint. When it first became a story, it was a sad beginning because it didn't turn out to be a canal after all. It was a good place to build a canal, but unfortunately the weather didn't cooperate, and so it took us almost the sesquicentennial, the 150 years of involving time, to finally mold itself into a modern, vibrant, recreational community. In addition to the tragedy and the comedy of Crystal Lake, there's a sequel, sesquicentennial, which we're celebrating this summer with several events. Maybe some of you saw the Grand Marshal on the parade tooting his horn and pulling the plug. And I will do that tonight as well. We've already got a portion of that. But I will kind of follow more or less the table of contents in the little sesquicentennial booklet. There's old stuff, something borrowed, something blue. There's some new stuff that's been created. I tried to do it with artificial intelligence, but I wasn't smart enough to figure that one out. plus the large language base that they use to create artificial intelligence only goes back about a century, and it didn't get the right Archibald Jones to begin with. So with that ado, let's start with the first slide. Some of you will recognize this maybe from your childhood. In 1889, that's when the railroad first came to Beulah. No, just kidding. But that's the panorama of the east end of Crystal Lake, circa 1889, when the little stub of the railroad came up to the station that had just moved from the Betsy River location to downtown Beulah, such as it is. I like to compare make the comparison here in that this is where civilization, as of 1888, met the primeval forest, because they were still logging the pine trees around the lake. On the far right, you see a pile of logs that was probably cleared within the past year or so. But interesting enough, if you look real close, you can see some small tripods there where they're putting in nursery stock for new trees in straight rows and things to improve upon nature. That's kind of ironic. You can see various features of the lake in the far distance. If you use your imagination a little bit, you'll see Lake Michigan over the hills of Point Betsy. On the North Shore, there's not too much there. In fact, there was only about 5 farms around Crystal Lake at the time of the tragedy, and 14 years earlier in 1873. I pattern myself as being the current president of the Benzie County River Improvement Company, a company in name only, no assets, no liabilities. And I toot my horn pretending I'm a president of a company. So keep that in mind. The vintage view here was some old sepia prints that were in the Historical Society library, also in the Bentley Library and the University of Michigan, where I happened to find the original plat map of Crystal Lake, but no surveyor notes. That prompted me to find the surveyor notes in the Benzie Central government offices, put the two together, and I've been at it ever since. So it's been quite a journey from childhood remembrances of a funny little story to a book, and I'm still continuing with literally hundreds of computer files. I've gotten to know a lot of people, nice, friendly people, and a few scoundrels here and there. That you ask people, have you heard the story of Crystal Lake? And then they say, they'll nod sagely, or they'll say no, or yes. And then you kind of get your conversation going at an art fair or a public street or a bar. I don't go to bars that often anymore. But it's a fun story to tell. Sad, happy, tragic, comic. Let's do the next slide. Next slide, please. I thought it appropriate at least have some words here. I won't phrase the entire thing, but many of you know Bruce Catton was a local historian that wrote much about the Civil War. A lot of us, when we were in our teenage years, probably, we read about the Civil War and all of the sadness and happiness that came out of that war, the tragedy and comedy. But this is somewhat similar to what he had in the Waiting for the Morning Train book, which is a classic in this area. In fact, there's 2 pages of quotes on that latter one in my book. This one was in the Holiday magazine that my folks subscribed to back in the 50s, and I remember it quite well. But it's one man's view, but he certainly thinks he got the sentiments of many of us who live in the watershed now. So let's look at the next slide. I said I could do a short version or a long version. I can do it in verse. I'm not too good an artist, but I have done some watercolors. But poems, let me recite this one, because it tells the whole nutshell. Canal, locale, sticks and stones, Archibald Jones. Waves great, For God's sakes, Crystal Lake dam break, lower level, what the devil, inundate, water gate, future canal, supernatural, a breach or a beach, a tragedy or a comedy. And now you got the plot, the beginning and the end. I think I can conclude the evening, and thanks for your attendance. No, just kidding again. Let's continue with our slides here. We'll give you the long version. Next. Crystal Lake is unique or ubiquitous. It's one of a kind, or it's one of several. It's got a lot of commonalities with other large lakes in northwest lower Michigan. But it's in the top 10 in depth, area, volume, and beauty, and inhabitants. Not number of inhabitants, quality of inhabitants. And it's visible from outer space, as you can see. If you can locate the Traverse Bay region there, we're just around the corner. And of course, this lake looks a lot bigger on the map. And that's sort of the moral of the story here. It's not a shadow of its former self, but it's definitely lost about 8% of its volume because of one man's opportunity to try to build a canal. So next slide, please. So which one is the real Archibald Jones? Well, let you take your pick on this. There's an older gentleman who came from New York State by way of several different states in between, and happened to meet a former Benzonian in Chicago, Irving Park, Illinois, actually, and talked to the Reverend James Barr Walker, who was the unknown, forgotten founder of Benzonia. He played second fiddle to Charles Bailey, who was a wheeler dealer, real estate person that most people think is the founder, but James Barr Walker was the brains behind and the money behind the founding of Benzonia in 1854. Teddy Roosevelt, well, a lot of people like Teddy Roosevelt, he dug the Panama Canal. In fact, that's one why I had the parody on the title, A Man, A Plan, A Canal. Panama originated from that back during the Panama Canal construction times. So I've lengthened it to a man, a plan, a canal, a beach, a panorama. It doesn't spell the same back. It's not a palindrome in the true sense, but it kind of gives you the feel that we're all part of a panorama here. Next guy down there was bigger than life. Archibald Jones was bigger than life. He wanted to build a canal boat. He wanted to take settlers up the stream into the barrens of central Benzie County, which was really the boonies in 1873. And then, of course, for one reason or another, which we'll explain in more detail, the water went out of Crystal Lake, and Archibald Jones was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. That's supposed to be a funny pun. Now look at the bottom group here. We've got a young whippersnapper there, about 4.5 years old on Crystal Lake. I think it was me doing something there. There's a kind of a middle-aged Archie when I started assuming the role back in the late 80s. And there's the old curmudgeon, liberal, littering, Victorian, lakeside dweller. Of course, we're all part of the watershed. We can be natives, we can be visitors, we can be residents both summer and winter. We're all called watersheddies. So you're a sheddy for short if you belong part of the watershed. So next slide. This is a more detailed explanation of the invitation to the sesquicentennial, sesqui meaning literally 1.5. So it's a century plus a half a century or 150 years that we're celebrating the anniversary of the lowering of Crystal Lake. It's exemplified in the commemorative booklet here. There's a shortcut to the webpage there. I won't read it off, but if you'd like to look at it, it gives a detail of some of the activities we have planned for this summer, plus a little bit of the history about that. And there's the equation, lakey plus towny plus county, which is a new one for me today, fudgy and set equals shetty. So take your pick of whoever you are. Now, as regards to the commemorative booklet, let's look at the table of contents in the next slide. I won't read all the details. You can read that either online at the website address that I gave you there, or you can help yourself to a sesquicentennial booklet. It's not strictly a sequel to the big book. It's not a sequel to the small book either. But it's kind of a collection of fun things to talk about. And in the very back is the Ballad of Archibald Jones, which we'll hear more about later on. So think about several different ways of telling the sad, happy, short, long story in terms of verse and short vignettes, in artwork, in pictures of reminiscence of old times or new times or forthcoming times. So we'll go from there and pick and choose with the next slide. This is my prologue in my book. Actually, the prologue was written 80 years after the famous epilogue that Mr. Case's son wrote when he was a World War I veteran. So both of these are in the book, and they're indelible in our memories here. So I won't read the details other than it was definitely a common for me inspiration about Crystal Lake. It meant a lot to me, a very heartfelt story. Next. And this is a dedication, and again, I'll kind of summarize because literally the book and the sesquicentennial are dedicated to Archibald Jones, who allegedly pulled the plug. In case you're wondering what the plug is, this is what the plug looks like. It's a little weatherboard after 150 years. And I did have fun pulling that during the Frankfort and Beulah parade for the 4th of July, being the Grand Marshal, although my shoulders kind of felt it afterwards. In addition to Archibald, there's the Case family, the whole past with those, the Baileys, especially Dr. James Barr Walker, who I mentioned, and many others to keep the story alive. And there's a lot of individuals with new story facts and suggestions that add to the whole of the story. I don't think a month has gone by in my life that I haven't learned something new about Crystal Lake that I didn't know before, or I assumed was corrected. And of course, the citizens make suggestions. I presume they'll hear a few new ones tonight. Why did you have my old Aunt Minnie in there, or Uncle Joe, because he had quite a story to tell too, and he fell off a canoe and almost drowned in Crystal Lake or something like that. Well, I'm always open for a new fact about Crystal Lake. And of course, it goes along with the visitors and our families who move away, have a career, and come back to Benzie County. And especially to my fans, family and friends who tolerate the idiosyncrasies of a lakeside curmudgeon. That's a mouthful to say. Next slide. This is kind of a prequel to a program that we'll have toward the end of the summer on Labor Day, which was kind of in conjunction with the Cold Creek Bridge Walk. If any of you are going to partake crossing an emulation of the Canal Bridge, only one that's 23.5 feet long, please join us, and then we'll have a small ceremony commemorating the Crystal Lake, and we'll read the story here in a slightly different version again. I won't go into the details, but all the local units of government have essentially signed in to these particular aspects, and we have a formal copy signed by the governor of Michigan, which we'll present at the Labor Day ceremony as well. And we'll have a symbolic pulling to that very plug there again for the 1,585th time, I think. And we'll all celebrate 150 years of the Lord of Crystal Lake by singing the song. Next. I've got two kind of detailed slides here to kind of explain the story as a panorama. Why should we write a singular, esoteric, uniquitous event, the tragedy? I got two twin acronyms, ubiquity and uniquity, almost spell the same. Sounds like a couple North American tribesmen. But it could be said of a cloud of mosquitoes or bugs in the woods that are ubiquitous. They're common everywhere at once. But one of a kind that doesn't seem to bite you is at first is uniquitous, uncommonly rare. And a lot of Michigan lakes have common histories, physiological features, hydrological behaviors, climatic influences, visual beauties, and recreational pursuits. We have visions of clear waters, bright sunshine, glittering in gentle waves, pristine beaches, wooded hillsides, scented of pine, a spirit of place. We escape this by vacationing at our special lake, underlying Crystal Lake, by experiencing carefree lives, roughing it, returning to a simple life, and communing with nature. The Crystal Lake vacation bug bites all. Next. Second one is a little more detailed because it's common histories, ports of refuge all along western Michigan shoreline. There's a list there up and down the coast, and we're kind of right in the northern third of this. But we were unique in that we had a lake that was left by the glacier 12,000 years ago, but it was 38 feet higher than the glacial Lake Algonquin. So it was really a big bathtub way up high on the hill. Most of the lakes that we're speaking here or drowned river mouths were only the order of 4 or 5 feet or 10 feet at most. We were 38 feet, and we're still 25 feet higher than Lake Michigan. So if we went out there with a plug and pulled a second plug or so, we'd drop some more water, and we could eventually drop down to the level of Lake Michigan. That's why, and then the big boats would come in and the exotic species and all the pitfalls of living that close to Lake Michigan. Let me emphasize here that this is a uniquitous event. It was the largest inundation from an inland lake due to an anthropogenic cause, that means an artificial cause, a dam breaching in U.S. history for 147 years. And that wasn't very evident until just a few years ago when I happened to try to research anything that was bigger than that, and I couldn't find anything. So we held the record up here for 147 years until the inundation that occurred in Midland in 2020, in May of 2020, which was actually 1,000 feet from my house. But I was fortunately 21 feet higher than that. So I've had the interesting experience of living and breathing the number one for about 147 years, or quite a few years. And now we're relegated to number two, we're only 50% lower than Midland. And we kind of blame it or give the credit to Archibald Jones, who's a bootstrap engineer. I won't go into the detail of his life that's in the book and all these countless relatives and things like that. But he did indeed found the Benzie County River Improvement Company and increased the uniquity of Crystal Lake. So here we have the man, the plan, the canal, the beach, and a panorama. Next slide, please. There's this continent. I've only found one photograph in the local paper. Long white beard. He was in his early 60s when he came here, so he was no spring chicken. He'd worked on the Erie Canal as a young man, been a orchestrator, fruit tree specialist, and continued that after he left here. And I'll refer to some poems that are in the commemorative book that detail his life and actions, so I don't have to repeat the history. And I'll interject some facts and figures as we go along too about the lake, so I don't delude you with a whole bunch of extraneous facts. Next slide, please. And there's still a physical presence. The house is kitty corner across from the Historical Society was the Archibald Jones house for 130 years. Ironically, I couldn't get a historical marker from the state of Michigan because he was a native-born citizen of Michigan, which I remedied by putting the marker that you see in the back. So there's a hefty bronze marker at the outlet. And if you go down through the trail, you'll see the history on one side and Archibald's continents on the other side. Next slide, please. And yes, there's a river, Benzie County River Improvement Company. At least it lives on in spirit. I'll read the three quotes down at the bottom because it's sort of a two-sided business card with my particulars on one side and Archibald's on the other. He's known to say the bottom of the river was too close to the top of the water. The top of Crystal Lake was too far above the beach. I wrote that one. And I built it better than I knew. So, how does this famous saying go? Our doubts are traitors that make us fear that could be off might win by fearing to attempt. Archibald was not fearsome to attempt. He attempted something, but unfortunately, Mother Nature did him. And the worst storm in 1873 kicked in, and that's all she wrote for the sad beginning. It just took a little bit of time to realize that he created a large beach that was worth a lot of money and it made it habitable rather than being a mountain goats walking around Crystal Lake with 1 foot in the water and one up the slope. We have two cottages, one 55 steps up from the road, and the other has got a full-blown basement, which I would have been underwater if I tried to build in 1873. Next slide, please. I said there's various ways to tell the story. These are some woodblock prints that were done in association with the book. It tells you can see the perspective from the Primordial wilderness all the way to Archibald Jones looking down from heaven there. And caricature with his head in his hands at an apparent failure, but I think he realized that he was a success. Next slide. This is kind of a lot of facts and figures. I just want to point out a few of them. Most of us know that Benzie County is one of the smallest counties in the area in the state of Michigan out of 83 counties. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of interesting facts that come along with us. That area in Lake Michigan is part of Benzie County. Two-thirds of Benzie County is Lake Michigan. Leelanau is even more so. If you took all the water in Crystal Lake, which is about 1/4 trillion gallons of water, and spread it all over the 300 and some square miles of Benzie County, it would be about 3 foot 6 inches right up to about my chest level. And there's a lot of other facts and figures in there. If you put a faucet on for 51 years, it would lower the top of Crystal Lake by 1 inch. So we got a lot of water there. Put a modern analogy to it, the dam that was blown up by the Russians in Ukraine, it was just about the reservoir was about the size of Crystal Lake, water, almost 1/4 trillion gallons of water. Crystal Lake lost 17 feet, which is, sometimes you see a sign in downtown Beulah that says at this site was the original level of Crystal Lake. Or you look at a 12-foot flagpole, you look at the bottom of the flagpole or the top of the flagpole is the height. Well, this panorama shows the beach at Beulah, where it once covered with about 12 feet of water. It actually dropped down its maximum of 17 feet. Then in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it bounced back. I think the loggers didn't want to haul the logs down the beach, and so they let it go back. Fortunately, there were about 7 or 8 temporary dams that were put in. Any old stick or stone would do, and then they'd have a log float across the river, across the lake, and then it was started another again in the next season. So finally, in 1911, a concrete dam was constructed, and that's what we have now. Next slide, please. You can have all sorts of ideas with your imagination of monsters in Crystal Lake. This is a 1935 topo map that was done by Bob McNamee and his daughter. And you can see the monster eating a chunk out of Beulah there on the right-hand side, and the whale taking a bite out of Point Betsy on the other side. Of course, there's various analogies, political and otherwise, that you can draw from this. The neutral political correct version is that it's Father Marquette with a pack on his back, looking in this direction. And it's Homer Simpson with a bad hairdo looking at the other direction. And I ask this every art fair that I go to, and I get new ideas all the time. But it's a large, deep lake, 250 gallons, almost 10,000 acres. It was 10,000 acres prior to 1873. Lost about 8% of its volume. Gained the 2,000 acres of beach, which is about 200 feet all the way around the lake, where we now have about 1,000 cottages, depending on how you cut fingers and toes. It also created real estate worth $500 million in real estate, a positive inundation, if you will. It was man-made, but it was positive inundation. Unlike Midland, Midland lost about $500 million in damages to property. They lost all their water. Next slide, please. And you can cut it down one watershed of 43 square miles with a lake of 10,000 acres, covering 35% of that. But you can go down through the hills and valleys around the lake and through the various creeks that form a watershed of their own or a sub-watershed. And it's like big fleas have little fleas and all that poetry. Big watersheds have little watersheds and sub-watersheds. Very self-contained, the Betsy River and the Platte River watersheds, which join these two. In fact, Crystal Lake watershed is a sub-watershed of the Betsy River watershed. Both of the larger watersheds are several hundred square miles. Next slide, please. And this is the new map that I had created by a GIS person from Western Michigan University. I actually have had 5 or 6 GIS since 2000, doing quite a few modifications that show where the original water line was there for the yellow beach, as you can see, almost all the way around the lake, mostly in the Beulah area and some close to the CSA on the west side. And then this one is okay, let's talk a little bit more about this one, because I originally had my key covered in Crystal Mountain and Thompsonville, and I never heard the end of it from my friends in that end, that they had their lake covered up by the title of the map. So I rectified that. That's why the eastern side, I have every nook and cranny in Benzie County on that map, and many of those small lakes for the Benzie watersheds grouping that the Benzie Conservation District sponsors. Originally, when they did the watershed, it looked like a footprint, but it didn't have that big toe that sticks way out into the center and into the eastern side of the county. So anything inside that is inside the watershed and flow, would eventually flow to Crystal Lake and then down the outlet. And anything outside of that goes out into the general county. Next slide. And this is a little saying, and I thought it was kind of interesting. Silently praise those who follow the plug, sending you circling the drain, for sometimes the only way out is through. And that's probably true. If we wanted to pull the plug like I indicated earlier, we'd probably lose more water and it wouldn't be the same around here anymore. Next slide. In fact, it's sometimes you might think of the level of the lake as being relatively constant because it's always halfway up a dock. It is a set regulatory level of 600 feet plus or minus a quarter of a foot, set in 1980 or so by court order. So Crystal Lake is a regulated lake level lake. It goes up sometimes with spring thaws and heavy rains. Sometimes as much as an inch or two. In fact, one rainstorm in the early 40s, they had a 12-inch rainstorm, but it's surprising the lake was 13 inches shallow at that time, so it didn't go anywhere. Next slide, please. I always have to say a good word for my dog, who, if you look real closely, you'll see the minnows in the lake. I'm sure other people have had fond stories of their dog. We would drive up it from Midland to Crystal Lake in the middle of the night, middle of the morning, and she'd run out on the dock and jump in, chase fish. It was black as pitch or light of dark, light of day. She never ate any, but she occasionally brought, I think she had a fish cushion as a puppy, and she got sort of conditioned to the lake. Next slide. There's the crew of the 4th of July parade from about 12 years ago. My 3 grandsons are in there in the front, emulating Archibald Jones. It's actually a working model. You'll see Crystal Lake on the hill on the right side, and Platte Lake and Betsy Lake on the lower side, connected by the 2 rivers. And it was actually running water before they outlawed squirt pistols and water and for the July parades. And I would extol the crowd to, shall we pull the plug on Crystal Lake? Half of them didn't know what I was talking about. Some brave souls said, pull the plug. So I would pull the plug and push the magic button underneath, and the water would gush down the rivers and then be pumped and recycled back again, and we do it over and over again during the parade. I still have the lake, but it gradually got too much to rebuild the dance floor on the boat trailer. I had it hitched to my belt loops for a while, carrying the plug on one hand and my canal boat horn in the other, but that got too strenuous. So now I ride in style. I had to take my lake, that little blue lake there, little Crystal, had that inside of a pontoon boat. Pontoon boat rested on a trailer driven by a truck on the road. So I think it was the first for Benzie County to have a lake in a boat. Next slide, please. And this is, of course, where it all began, circa about 1911. Finally, after all these makeshift dams, just throwing every stick and stone in to squash the flow for a while, they put in a concrete dam. And it wasn't more than the next several years, they had to cut about a foot off it because they built it too high. People were complaining about too high a water level. That's some of Archibald Jones' family friends or family members there, and I think his son, Irving Park Jones, took the picture. He was a photographer by trade. Next slide, please. And this is the replica of the historical marker that's at the outlet now. Two-sided bronze. You can't read the fine print, but basically it tells the history of the Benzie County River Improvement Company on one side and the family history of Archibald Jones on the other side. So now we celebrate him not so much as a goat for an infeasible land that didn't have surveyors working for him. And he was accused of not knowing the water flow downhill, but he was actually a bootstrap engineer who knew exactly what he was doing, had surveyors. And if it wasn't for the act of God with the torrential rain coming down and washing his dam out at the last minute, we probably would have had a canal for a long time on Crystal Lake. Next slide, please. After the company went bankrupt, he settled all his bills. He was an honest man. He moved to Illinois for doing horse trading for a while. And then eventually to Emporia, Kansas, where he went in business with some of his sons. Always had horses and fruit trading. No more canals, though. He had his success in favor of Crystal Lake. Interesting enough, the obelisk that centers around the actual gravestones his wife, Sophia, predeceased him by a few years, and she had her inscriptions on the granite obelisk, but there was a blank slate on Archibald's side. So several years ago, I teamed up with the great-great-granddaughter of Archibald, and we put the proper inscription in there, and then I added that he built it better than he knew as an inscription. It's on my bucket list to visit Emporia, Kansas sometime and put a copy of a book on his grave. Next slide. So, which would have been a preference? Happy ending, which we fairly have from a real estate standpoint. Not a sad beginning. We could have had a bucolic scene of the canal boats drifting lazily and romantically down a canal between Crystal Lake and Betsy Bay, or we could have had a raft full of tourists or other sheddies going back and forth. Unfortunately, the Crystal Lake canal boat was never materialized. Next slide. So the question I have posed to you again, if we really want to pull the plug again or put it back in again, I think we're just happy the way everything just turned out. And I invite you on Labor Day to come out and hear the proclamation, and we'll have a very official plug then. And I have some acknowledgement slides here. Let me just take the next one. Next slide. This gives you a relevance. The high was about 612 feet, and the low 595, and the now level is about 600 feet. Nice round number. So 12 feet of water is about 8%, and it's 56 billion gallons of water. The Midlands flood was 86 billion gallons, so it's not that much difference between number one and number two. Next slide. And to see how dopey people sometimes get, I suffered through a lightning strike in Midland back in there just about the time of the COVID, and it decimated a 120-foot white pine tree. It looked like a tuning fork. It had two large stems, and one was completely devastated. 2 years later, the whole tree died. I said, I don't need more firewood and kindling, so I contracted with a local chainsaw artist and said, I don't want Archibald Jones in my front yard. So there he is, big as life. And if you're ever down in the middle, near the Midland Hospital, you just drive by, you know where my house is. I'll probably put some signage on there too. But I must admit, the neighbors looked askance and said, what's this crazy guy doing in his front yard? Next slide. Just some special credits for some special people that have been helping immensely in preparation of the sesquicentennial. I ask you to be forgiving to try some of the things that are still on the schedule, including the proclamation on the Labor Day. There's a few other activities that are going to be, for those of you in the Crystal Lake Team Marathon, I'm hoping to start the race for the Team Marathon people. And the next slide. This acknowledges from my book. I won't read the detail. They're saying there's a lot of people. It's not a one-man band of trying to learn about Archibald Jones and Crystal Lake. Is a story that's shared around us. It's part of our heritage. And so I think that concludes the last slide, maybe. Oh no, we have the epilogue. This is a parallel to the prologue. This is the one that Walter Case wrote about the time that the tragedy of Crystal Lake was published, just after that. And then I think his last slide. Last slide. So if I want to go into the detail, I'm sure this is waiting down coffee tables around the lake. All the proceeds go to charitable deductions. But it's been a fun story, and it's still continuing. I'm still finding facts. And if you care to ask questions, you give me some ideas for future agendas, maybe we'll, another 150 years, we'll be doing the same thing again. Well, thank you for your attendance. I appreciate you.